The first thing you must understand about me is that I could read. In Virginia in 1849, this made me more dangerous than any weapon, more valuable than any tool, and more vulnerable than any child. My name is Octavia, and for 5 years, I lived as a spy in my own master's house, documenting horrors that would eventually lead to the discovery of 12 small graves and the violent death of one of Virginia's most respected plantation owners. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let me begin with the night my mother gave me the gift that would both save and damn us all. I was 7 years old when Mama pulled me aside in our cabin on the Randolph plantation, her weathered hands trembling as she opened a small leather book she had kept hidden beneath the floorboards. The candlelight flickered across pages filled with strange marks that I would soon learn were letters, words, the building blocks of knowledge that white folks guarded as jealously as they guarded their freedom. "Octavia, baby," she whispered, glancing nervously at the door. "I'm going to teach you something that could get us both killed, but it might also be the thing that saves you someday." My mother, Rose, had been raised in the house of a kind master in Charleston, a man who had allowed his slaves to learn reading and writing before the laws changed, and such education became forbidden. When she was sold to Master Randolph at age 16, she brought with her a secret more precious than gold: literacy. For 3 years, in the stolen hours between dusk and dawn, Mama taught me to read and write. We used charcoal on pieces of bark, scratching out letters and words that we would quickly destroy before anyone could discover them. She made me memorize everything, training my mind to become a living library that no master could confiscate or burn. "Remember, music, child," she would say as we practiced. "Knowledge is the one thing they can't take from you once you have it, but they'll kill you for having it, so you must never let them know." When I was 10, Mamar died of fever, taking with her the secret of my education. I mourned her loss, but I also understood that her death had given me a kind of protection. As long as no one suspected I could read and write, I would be invisible in a way that other slaves could never be. Master Cornelius Randolph was a man of 43 when I was assigned to work in his house. A widower who had recently remarried a much younger woman from Richmond society. He was considered one of the most respectable planters in Hanover County, music known for his fair treatment of slaves, his generous donations to the church, and his eloquent speeches about the moral responsibilities of slaveholders. What no one knew, what I would spend 5 years discovering, was that Cornelius Randolph was also a monster who had been murdering slave children for more than a decade. The first sign that something was wrong came during my second week in the big house. I was dusting Master Randolph's study when I overheard him talking with his overseer, a thin, nervous man named Pike, about a slave child who had gone missing. "Little Samuel just up and disappeared," Pike was saying, his voice carrying a note of confusion. "His mama says he was there when she went to sleep, gone when she woke up. No sign of struggle, no tracks leading away from the quarters." Master Randolph barely looked up from the papers he was reading. "Probably ran off to find his father. Music. You know how these children are. No sense of loyalty or gratitude. But, sir, the boy was only 8 years old. How far could he get on his own? Far enough to be someone else's problem?" Randolph replied coldly, "Mark him down as a runaway and dock his mother's rations for a week. Maybe that will teach her to keep better track of her property." I continued dusting. Music. My movements slow and methodical, but my mind was racing. Something about Master Randolph's tone didn't match his words. He spoke about the missing child with the casual indifference of someone discussing lost livestock. But there was something else beneath the surface, a satisfaction that made my skin crawl. Over the following months, I began to notice a pattern. Every few months, a slave child would disappear from the plantation, always children between the ages of 6 and 12. Always during the night, always without a trace. Master Randolph would invariably claim that the children had been sold to traders heading for the Deep South, but I never saw any bills of sale, never witnessed any transactions. More disturbing was the way the other slaves reacted to these disappearances. Music. Instead of the grief and anger I expected, there was a kind of resigned terror, as if they suspected something terrible, but were too frightened to voice their fears. Parents would hold their remaining children closer, but they never asked questions about where the missing ones had gone. It was during my second year in the house that I discovered why the slaves were so afraid to ask questions. I was cleaning the parlor late one evening when I overheard Master Randolph talking with his new wife, Elelena, about the plantation's discipline problems. "The slaves have been unusually quiet lately," Elelena observed, setting down her needlework. "Even the children seem subdued." Randolph smiled, but there was no warmth in the expression. They've learned the importance of obedience. My dear, sometimes a master must make examples to ensure proper behavior. Examples? What kind of examples? Nothing you need concern yourself with, Nena. The management of slaves is a man's responsibility. But I could see the satisfaction in his eyes, the pride of someone who had solved a problem through methods he couldn't openly discuss. And I began to understand that the missing children weren't being sold. They were being used as examples, warnings to the other slaves about the consequences of disobedience. My suspicions crystallized into certainty during my 3rd year in the house when I witnessed something that would haunt my dreams for the rest of my life. I had been sent to fetch a book from Master Randolph's study when I discovered him reading a letter that had been left open on his desk. My ability to read, hidden for so many years, finally proved its worth. The letter was from a slave trader in Richmond, thanking Randolph for his continued business, but expressing concern about the quality of merchandise he had been receiving. The last 3 children you sent were in such poor condition that I could not place them with any respectable buyers. The letter read, "If you continue to send damaged goods, I will be forced to seek other suppliers." But it was Randolph's handwritten response lying beside the letter that made my blood run cold. "The children you received were already dead when I sent them. I trust you disposed of them properly as we discussed. The next shipment will be in better condition." I stood frozen in that study, the full horror of what I had discovered washing over me like ice water. Master Randolph wasn't selling slave children. He was killing them and sending their bodies to a trader who was helping him dispose of the evidence. The examples he had been making were corpses, and the trader in Richmond was his accomplice in covering up mass murder. I forced myself to finish my cleaning, my hands shaking as I dusted around the incriminating documents. When I left the study, I walked calmly to my quarters. But inside, I was screaming with rage and terror. I had uncovered a secret so monstrous that it defied comprehension, and I was completely powerless to stop it. That night, I made a decision that music would define the next 5 years of my life. I would become a spy in my master's house, documenting his crimes with the literacy my mother had given music me, gathering evidence that might someday bring him to justice. I had no plan for how I would use this evidence, no idea if anyone would ever believe the word of a slave against a respected white man, but I knew I had to try. I began by stealing paper and ink from Master Randolph's study, taking only small amounts that wouldn't be missed. I created a hiding place in my quarters, hollowing out a space behind a loose board in the wall, music, where I could conceal my growing collection of evidence. And I started writing, music recording every conversation I overheard, every document I glimpsed, every suspicious behavior I witnessed. The work was dangerous beyond imagination. If Master Randolph discovered that I could read and write, he would certainly kill me to protect his secret. But I was driven by the memory of 12 missing children and the knowledge that more would disappear unless someone stopped him. As I began my secret documentation, I had no idea that I was about to uncover horrors that would shock even my worst expectations. The missing children were just the beginning of Master Randolph's crimes, and the truth I would eventually expose would destroy not only him, but everyone connected to his monstrous secret. The education my mother had given me in those stolen hours by candlelight was about to become the weapon that would bring down one of Virginia's most respected citizens and reveal the depths of depravity that slavery could conceal behind a facade of Christian respectability. The autumn of 1852 brought an early frost to Virginia, and with it the opportunity I had been waiting for without knowing it. For 3 years I had been documenting Master Randolph's suspicious behavior, collecting fragments of evidence like a scholar, music assembling a puzzle whose final image remained hidden. But on a cold October morning, I would finally see the complete picture, and the sight would scar my soul forever. It began with little Mary, the 6-year-old daughter of Sarah, one of the field hands. Mary had been sick with fever for a week, growing weaker each day, despite her mother's desperate attempts, music, to nurse her back to health. I had seen this pattern before. A child would fall ill. Master Randolph would take a sudden interest in their condition, and within days the child would disappear. I was serving breakfast when Master Randolph mentioned Mary's condition to his wife, his voice carrying that same note of false concern. "I had learned to recognize the little girl in cabin 7 is quite ill," he said, cutting his ham with precise movements. "I fear she may not recover. Perhaps we should send for Dr. Morrison," Eleanor suggested. Her genuine compassion, a stark contrast to her husband's calculated indifference. "I don't think that will be necessary, my dear. Some conditions are beyond medical intervention. The way he, music, said it, with such finality, such certainty, made my blood run cold. He wasn't expressing concern about Mary's illness. He was announcing her death sentence. That evening, I watched from my window as Master Randolph left the big house, carrying a small bundle and a shovel. He moved with the purposeful stride of a man on a familiar errand, music, heading toward the woods that bordered the eastern edge of the plantation. Every instinct told me to stay in my quarters, to pretend I'd seen nothing. But I knew this might be my only chance to discover what happened to the missing children. I waited until he had disappeared into the treeline, then slipped out of the house and followed at a safe distance. The moon was nearly full, providing enough light to track his movements without getting close enough to be detected. He moved through the forest with the confidence of someone who knew the path well, never hesitating at the various forks and clearings. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes, Master Randolph stopped in a small clearing deep in the woods. I crept as close as I dared, hiding behind a fallen log about 50 yards away, and watched in horror as he began music to dig. The hole he excavated was small, child-sized, and perfectly rectangular, as if he had done this many times before. When he finished digging, he unwrapped the bundle he had carried, revealing the tiny, still form of little Mary. Even from my hiding place, I could see that she was not moving, not breathing, but what happened next was even more horrifying than I had imagined, as Master Randolph placed Mary's body in the grave. She stirred weakly, her small hand moving in a feeble gesture that proved she was still alive. He had brought her here to bury her while she still breathed, to dispose of a sick child like a piece of broken property. I bit my hand to keep from screaming as I watched him shovel dirt over the tiny form, covering her face, music, her reaching hand, her final desperate movements. The sound of earth hitting her body seemed to echo through the forest like thunder, though I knew it was barely audible beyond music, the clearing. When he finished, Master Randolph stood over the fresh grave for music a moment, then pulled out a small notebook and made an entry with a pencil. He was keeping records of his murders, documenting them with the same methodical precision he used for his legitimate business transactions. I remained hidden until long after he had left, my body shaking with rage and horror. When I was certain he was gone, I crept into the clearing and knelt beside Mary's grave. The earth was still soft, and I could hear faint sounds from below, scratching, whimpering, the desperate struggles of a child buried alive. I began to dig frantically with my bare hands, tearing at the soil until my fingernails bled music, but it was too late. By the time I reached her, Mary was still and silent, her small face peaceful in death. I held her tiny body and wept, mourning not just for her, but for all the children who had suffered the same fate. But even in my grief, I forced myself to think strategically. I carefully replaced the soil, making the grave look undisturbed, then memorized every detail of the location. I counted my steps back to the main path, noted the distinctive trees and rock formations that would help me find music this place again. This grave would be evidence, and I would need to be able to lead others here when the time came. Over the following months, I made it my mission to locate the other graves. Using the knowledge I had gained from following Master Randolph, I explored the forest systematically, looking for areas of disturbed earth, unusual depressions, or other signs of burial. The work was heartbreaking and terrifying, but I forced myself to continue. I found 11 more graves scattered throughout the woods, each one marking the final resting place of a child who had been murdered by the man who owned them. Some of the graves were old, the earth settled and overgrown with vegetation. Others were relatively fresh, the soil still dark and loose. Each discovery added another name to the list I was compiling, another piece of evidence in the case I was building. The psychological toll of this knowledge was almost unbearable. I continued to work in Master Randolph's house, serving his meals, cleaning his rooms, listening to his conversations, all while knowing that he was a mass murderer of children. I watched him interact with his wife, attend church services, and conduct business with other plantation owners, maintaining the facade of a respectable Christian gentleman, while secretly disposing of sick or troublesome slave children like garbage. The most difficult part was interacting with the parents of the missing children. They would ask me if I had heard anything, music, about where their babies had gone, and I had to lie to their faces, telling them I knew nothing while carrying the terrible knowledge of their children's fate. I wanted desperately to tell them the truth, to give them the music closure of knowing what had happened, but I knew that revealing my knowledge would only result in my own death, music, and the continuation of Randolph's crimes. Instead, I continued my secret documentation, recording every detail of what I had discovered. I drew maps showing the locations of the graves, wrote detailed descriptions of each burial site, and compiled a list of the missing children with dates and circumstances of their disappearances. I also began copying documents from Master Randolph's study whenever I had the opportunity, building a comprehensive record of his correspondence with the slave trader in Richmond. The evidence I was gathering painted a picture of systematic murder that had been going on for more than a decade. Master Randolph had been killing slave children since at least 1841, always selecting victims who were sick, disabled, or considered troublesome. He had developed a relationship with a corrupt slave trader who helped him dispose of the bodies and provided false documentation to explain the children's disappearances. But it was in 1853 that I witnessed something that pushed me beyond the breaking point and forced me to become an active participant in his crimes. Master Randolph had selected his next victim, a 10-year-old boy named Joshua, who had been born with a withered arm and was considered music defective by plantation standards. "Octavia," Master Randolph said one evening, his voice carrying a casual authority that made my skin crawl. "I need you to help me with a task, music, tomorrow night. We'll be taking a walk in the woods." I knew immediately what he meant, music, and the thought of being forced to participate in the murder of a child made me physically ill. But I also realized that this might be my opportunity to gather music, the final piece of evidence I needed, direct witness testimony of Master Randolph committing murder. The next evening, I followed him into the forest, carrying the shovel he had given me, while he carried the drugged but still breathing form of little Joshua. We walked to a new location, deeper in the woods than any of the other graves. Music and Master Randolph ordered me to dig. "The boy is suffering," he said, his voice carrying a note of false compassion. "We're being merciful, ending his music pain before it becomes unbearable." But Joshua wasn't suffering from anything, music, except the drug Master Randolph had given him. He was simply a child whose physical disability made him less valuable as property, and his master had decided to dispose of him rather than continue feeding and housing him. I dug the grave, music, with tears streaming down my face, each shovel full of earth, feeling like a betrayal of everything I believed in. When the hole was deep enough, Master Randolph placed music Joshua's still breathing body inside and ordered me to cover him. "Please, Master," I whispered, my voice, music, breaking with emotion. "Let me take him back to his mama. She could care for him, nurse him back to health." "The boy is already dead, Octavia," he replied coldly. "We're simply disposing of the body now. Cover him up or I'll put you in there with him." I had no choice. With shaking hands, I shoveled earth over Joshua's small form, listening to his muffled cries grow weaker and finally stop. I was now not just a witness to Master Randolph's crimes, but an accomplice forced to participate music in the murder of an innocent child. As we walked back to the plantation, Master Randolph spoke to me with the casual tone of someone discussing the weather. "I trust I can count on your discretion, Octavia. You understand the consequences of speaking about what we've done tonight." I nodded, not trusting my voice to remain steady. But inside, I was making a different kind of promise. Music. I would find a way to expose his crimes to bring justice for Joshua and Mary and all the other children whose lives he had stolen. The evidence I had been gathering for 4 years would finally be put to use, and Master Randolph would pay for every small grave hidden in his forest of secrets. The time for silent observation was ending. Soon I would have to find the courage to speak, knowing that my words would either bring justice or result in my own music death. But the faces of 12 murdered children demanded nothing less than the truth, and I would, music, not let their deaths be in vain. By the spring of 1854, my hidden cache of evidence had grown into a comprehensive record of Master Randolph's crimes that would have impressed any prosecutor in Virginia, if such evidence could ever be presented by a slave against her master. 5 years of careful documentation had produced a collection of papers, maps, and testimonies that painted a picture of systematic murder spanning more than a decade. The hiding place behind the loose board in my quarters had become a shrine to the dead children, a secret archive that I tended with the devotion of a scholar maintaining a library. Every piece of paper was carefully preserved, every map precisely drawn, every date and name verified multiple times. Music. I had become the unofficial historian of Master Randolph's atrocities, the only person alive who knew the full scope of his crimes. The psychological burden of carrying this knowledge was crushing. Each day, I watched Master Randolph go about his normal routine, eating breakfast with his wife, conducting business with other planters, attending church services where he was respected as a pillar of the community. The contrast between his public persona and his secret activities was so stark that I sometimes wondered if I was losing my mind. but the evidence was undeniable. My collection included detailed maps showing the locations of 12 graves in the forest, music, each marked with the child's name and date of death. I had verified each burial site multiple times, ensuring that my directions were precise enough to guide searchers directly to the remains. Copies of correspondence between Master Randolph and the slave trader in Richmond, documenting their conspiracy to dispose of murdered children. I had painstakingly copied these letters during my cleaning duties, memorizing entire passages when I couldn't risk taking the originals, a complete list of the missing children, including their names, ages, physical descriptions, and the circumstances of their disappearances. This list had grown to include not just the 12 I had found buried in the forest, but several others whose bodies had apparently been disposed of through the Richmond trader, detailed accounts of conversations I had overheard, including Master Randolph's discussions with his overseer about which children to remove next, and his instructions to me about participating in Joshua's murder. Most damning of all, I had discovered Master Randolph's own record-keeping system. He maintained a private ledger hidden in a secret compartment of his desk, where he documented each murder with the same meticulous attention to detail he applied to his legitimate business transactions. I had managed to copy several pages of this ledger during my cleaning duties, providing irrefutable proof of his crimes in his own handwriting. The ledger entries were chillingly matter-of-fact. March 15, 1851. Samuel, music, age 8, fever, disposed of in usual manner. Location, Oak Grove Clearing, July 22, 1851. Rebecca, age 7, lame leg, sent to Richmond. Contact, no further action required. October 3, 1852. Mary, age 6, consumption, personal disposal. Location, Music Pine Ridge site. Each entry represented a child's life reduced to a few words in a business ledger. Their deaths recorded with the same casual efficiency as the purchase of livestock or the sale of cotton. But it was the most recent entries that filled me with the greatest dread. January 12, 1854. Joshua, age, music 10, withered arm. Personal disposal with assistance. Location, deep forest site. March 8, 1854. Planning removal of Thomas, age 9. Behavioral problems, awaiting opportunity. Master Randolph was planning to kill again, and I knew that Thomas, a spirited boy who had been caught stealing food for his sick mother, was next on his list. The knowledge that another child would die unless I acted, music, was becoming unbearable. The strain of maintaining my facade of ignorance while carrying such terrible knowledge was taking its toll on my health and sanity. I had lost music weight, developed a persistent cough, and found it increasingly difficult to sleep. The other house slaves had begun to notice my deteriorating condition, but I couldn't explain what was wrong without revealing my secret. "Octavia, child, you look like death warmed over," said Mommy Ruth, the elderly cook, who had worked in the big house longer than anyone. "You need to tell me what's troubling you before it eats you alive." But how could I tell her that I had been documenting our master's murders for 5 years? How could I explain that I had been forced to help bury a child alive? The knowledge I carried was too dangerous to share, too horrible to speak aloud. Instead, I threw myself deeper into my documentation. Driven by the desperate hope that someday, somehow, I would find a way to use the evidence I had gathered, I began making multiple copies of the most important documents, hiding them in different locations around the plantation. If something happened to my main cache, at least some record of Master Randolph's crimes would survive. I also started paying closer attention to the visitors who came to the plantation, hoping to identify someone who might be sympathetic to my cause. Most of Master Randolph's associates were cut from the same cloth, wealthy planters who viewed slaves as property and would never believe accusations against one of their own. But occasionally there were others, traveling ministers, music business associates from the north, government officials who might have different perspectives. It was during one of these visits that I first heard about the growing abolitionist movement in the North and the Underground Railroad that was helping slaves escape music to freedom. A traveling preacher named Reverend Matthews had come to conduct a revival meeting, and I overheard him discussing the moral questions surrounding slavery with Master Randolph. "The institution is under increasing scrutiny," Reverend Matthews was saying as I served their evening meal. "There are those in the North who claim that slavery is inherently evil, music that no Christian can participate in it with a clear conscience." Master Randolph's response was predictably dismissive. "Northern agitators who have never owned property or managed a plantation. They don't understand the realities of our situation or the burden we bear in civilizing an inferior race." but I could see that Reverend Matthews was not entirely convinced by this argument. His questions were probing, his manner skeptical. Music. Here was a man who might be willing to listen to the truth about what happened on southern plantations. That night, music, I made a decision that terrified me. I would approach Reverend Matthews and try to give him my evidence. It was an enormous risk. If he betrayed me to Master Randolph, I would certainly be killed, but the alternative was to continue watching children die while I remained silent. I waited until the early hours of the morning when the house was quiet and Reverend Matthews was alone in the guest room where he was staying. I crept through the darkened halls, my heart pounding so loudly I was certain it would wake the entire household. I knocked softly on his door, and when he opened it, I pressed a folded paper into his hands. "Please, sir," I whispered, "dread this when you're alone. Lives depend on it." Before he could respond, I fled back to my quarters, leaving him standing in the doorway with my carefully written summary of Master Randolph's crimes. The paper contained the locations of 3 graves, music, the names of the children buried there, and enough detail to prove that I had witnessed the murders firsthand. The next morning, I watched anxiously for any sign that Reverend Matthews had read my message and believed it, but his behavior gave nothing away. He conducted the morning service as planned, shared breakfast with the Randolph family, and prepared to depart for his next appointment. It wasn't until he was climbing into his carriage that he gave me any indication that he had received my message. As the carriage pulled away, he looked directly at me and nodded once, a small gesture that filled me with hope. But days passed, then weeks, music, and nothing happened. No investigators came to the plantation. No authorities questioned Master Randolph about missing children. I began to fear that Reverend Matthews had either not believed my account or had decided that the word of a slave was insufficient evidence to pursue such serious accusations. Meanwhile, Master Randolph was moving forward with his plans for Thomas. I overheard him discussing the boy's behavioral problems with his overseer, and I knew that time was running out. If I couldn't find a way to stop him soon, another child would die, and I would once again be forced to participate in the murder. It was then that fate intervened in the form of an unexpected music visitor. In early June 1854, a man named William Harrison arrived at the plantation, introducing himself as a lawyer from Richmond who was investigating reports of irregularities in the slave trade. Music. He claimed to be working for a consortium of northern investors who were concerned about the legal status of slaves they had purchased through Virginia dealers. Master Randolph received Harrison with the polite caution that any planter would show to a lawyer asking questions about his business practices, but I could see the tension in his posture, the careful way he chose his words when discussing the children who had been sold over the years. "I have complete records of all transactions," Master Randolph assured Harrison, producing a ledger that I knew contained only falsified entries. "Every slave sold from this plantation has proper documentation." But Harrison was more thorough than Master Randolph had expected. Music. He asked specific questions about individual children, requested to see bills of sale, and inquired about the traders who had purchased them. With each question, Master Randolph's answers became more evasive, his manner more defensive. That evening, as I served dinner to the 2 men, I made another desperate decision. When I refilled Harrison's water glass, I slipped him a small piece of paper with a single word written on it: Forest. Harrison glanced at the paper, then at me, his expression carefully neutral, but I could see the intelligence in his eyes, the quick mind processing the implications of my cryptic message. The next morning, Harrison announced that he would be extending his stay for several days to Music complete his investigation. Master Randolph had no choice but to agree, though I could see his growing anxiety about the lawyer's persistent questions. That night, I made the most dangerous decision of my life. I retrieved my entire collection of evidence from its hiding place and prepared to deliver it to Harrison, knowing that this action would either save the remaining children or result in my own death. The time for silent observation was over. After 5 years of documenting horrors, I was finally ready to speak the truth, regardless of the consequences. The night of June 15, 1854 would mark the end of my 5 years of silent documentation and the beginning of the most dangerous 24 hours of my life. I had made my decision to trust William Harrison with the evidence I had gathered. But the act of actually delivering that evidence required a courage I wasn't certain I possessed. I waited until well past midnight, when the plantation had settled into the deep quiet that preceded dawn. Master Randolph was a heavy sleeper, aided by the substantial amounts of music he consumed each evening, and his wife, Elena, took laudanum for her nerves, ensuring that she would not wake easily. The other house slaves were exhausted from their daily labors and slept the dreamless sleep of the utterly weary. Moving through the darkened house like a ghost, I made my way to the guest room where Harrison was staying. My arms were full of papers, 5 years of careful documentation, maps, copied letters, and testimonies that represented the most complete record of systematic murder ever, music compiled by a slave. The weight of the evidence felt enormous, as if I were carrying the souls of 12 dead children in my hands. I knocked softly on Harrison's door, my heart hammering against my ribs with such force that I was certain it would wake the entire household. When he opened the door, I saw that he was fully dressed despite the late hour, as if he had been expecting my visit. "Mr. Harrison," I whispered, "I have something you need to see, something that will explain why so many children have disappeared from this plantation." He stepped aside to let me enter, closing the door carefully behind me. By the light of a single candle, I spread my evidence across his writing desk. Maps showing the locations of graves, lists of murdered children, copies of incriminating correspondence, and excerpts from Master Randolph's secret ledger. Harrison examined each document with the methodical attention of a trained lawyer, his expression growing more grave with each revelation. When he finished reading, he looked at me with a mixture of amazement and horror. "My God, music," he whispered. "You've documented a systematic campaign of murder spanning more than a decade. How did you manage to gather all this evidence without being discovered?" "I can read and write," I said simply. "Master Randolph doesn't know." "So, he's never been careful about what he says or leaves lying around when I'm cleaning his study." Harrison studied the maps more closely, tracing the locations I had marked with his finger. "These graves, you've seen them yourself?" "I've seen them all. I was forced to help dig one of them." The memory of Joshua's murder threatened to overwhelm me, but I forced myself to continue. "Master Randolph has been killing slave children for years, then either burying them in the forest or sending their bodies to a trader in Richmond who helps dispose of the evidence. And you have proof of this conspiracy." I showed him the copied correspondence between Master Randolph and the Richmond trader, pointing out the references to damaged goods and disposal services. Harrison read the letters twice, his lawyer's mind processing the legal implications of what I was showing him. "This is extraordinary," he said finally. "But you understand the challenges we face in pursuing this case. The testimony of a slave against her master is not admissible in Virginia courts. Even with all this evidence, it would be nearly impossible to secure a conviction through normal legal channels." My heart sank. I had spent 5 years gathering evidence, had risked my life repeatedly to document Master Randolph's crimes, and now I was being told that none of it mattered because of the color of my skin. But Harrison wasn't finished. "However," he continued, "there are other ways to pursue justice. If we can find the graves and recover the bodies, the physical evidence would be undeniable. A dozen murdered children would create a scandal that no amount of legal maneuvering could suppress. You believe me?" I asked, hardly daring to hope. "I believe the evidence," he replied. "And I believe that you've shown remarkable courage in gathering it. But now comes the most dangerous part. We need to verify your claims by finding those graves." Harrison explained that he was not just a lawyer investigating slave trading irregularities, but an agent working for a network of abolitionists who were documenting the worst abuses of slavery. His real mission was to gather evidence that could be used to turn Northern public opinion against the institution, and my documentation of systematic child murder was exactly the kind of proof they needed. "If we can expose this," he said, "it will demonstrate that slavery doesn't just exploit human labor. Music. It creates monsters who view human children as disposable property." The moral argument against slavery will become impossible to ignore. We spent the rest of the night planning our next moves. Harrison would need to examine the graves to verify my claims, but doing so without alerting Master Randolph would require careful timing and considerable risk. We decided that he would extend his stay for several more days, claiming that his investigation required additional documentation while I guided him to the burial sites during the early morning hours when the plantation was least active. The next 3 days were the most terrifying of my life. Each morning before dawn, I led Harrison into the forest, showing him the locations where Master Randolph had buried his victims. We moved carefully, avoiding the main paths and staying alert for any signs that we were being followed. Harrison examined each gravesite with the thoroughness of a trained investigator, taking notes about the locations, measuring distances, and collecting soil samples that showed evidence of decomposition. At 2 of the sites, we carefully excavated enough earth to reveal fragments of clothing and small bones that confirmed the presence of human remains. "This is more than enough evidence," Harrison told me after we had visited the last gravesite. 12 burial locations, physical evidence of human remains, and your detailed documentation of how the murders were committed. No jury in America would ignore this, regardless of who provided the initial testimony, but our investigation had not gone unnoticed. On the fourth morning, as we returned from the forest, we found Master Randolph waiting for us in the yard behind the big house. His face was a mask of cold fury, and I knew immediately that our secret had been discovered. "Mr. Harrison," he said, his voice carrying the deadly calm of a man who had killed before and was prepared to kill again, "I believe you've been conducting unauthorized explorations of my property." Harrison stepped slightly in front of me, a protective gesture that I appreciated, even though I knew it would do little good against a man like Master Randolph. I was simply taking a morning walk to enjoy the natural beauty of your forest. With my slave as a guide, how convenient that Octavia should know exactly which paths to take, which clearings to visit. Master Randolph's eyes fixed on me with the intensity of a predator studying its prey. "Tell me, Octavia, what have you been showing our guest?" I forced myself to meet his gaze, drawing on reserves of courage I didn't know I possessed. "I showed him the graves, Master, all 12 of them." The admission hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Master Randolph's face went white, then red, as the implications of my words sank in. He had been exposed, his carefully guarded secret revealed to an outsider who now possessed the power to destroy him. "You lying little bitch," he snarled, stepping toward me with his hand raised to strike. "I should have killed you years ago when I first suspected you were too smart for your own good." But Harrison moved between us, his own hand resting on the pistol he carried beneath his coat. "I wouldn't do that if I were you, Randolph. Striking a witness in front of a federal investigator would be advisable." "Federal investigator?" Master Randolph's voice cracked with shock and fear. "William Harrison, United States Attorney's Office, Richmond District. I'm here investigating reports of murder and conspiracy involving the illegal disposal of human remains, and thanks to Miss Octavia's courageous testimony, I now have enough evidence to proceed with formal charges." The confrontation that followed was brief, but decisive. Master Randolph attempted to flee, but Harrison had anticipated this possibility and had already alerted federal marshals who were waiting at the plantation's borders. Within hours, Randolph was in custody, and teams of investigators were excavating the grave sites I had identified. The discovery of 12 small skeletons in the forest created a sensation that spread far beyond Virginia. Newspapers across the nation reported the story of the monster of Hanover County and the brave slave woman who had exposed his crimes. The evidence I had gathered over 5 years became the foundation for the most shocking murder trial in Virginia history. Master Randolph never lived to face that trial. 3 days after his arrest, as news of his crimes spread throughout the county, a mob of enraged citizens, including several plantation owners who were horrified by the revelation that one of their own had been murdering children, stormed the jail where he was being held. They dragged him from his cell and hanged him from the nearest tree, ensuring that he would never have the opportunity to explain or justify his actions. The lynching was swift and brutal, but it was also a form of justice that the legal system might never have provided. A white man accused of murdering slave children might have escaped conviction through legal technicalities or sympathetic juries, but the physical evidence of 12 graves had created a level of outrage that transcended racial boundaries. Eleanor Randolph, faced with the devastating revelation of her husband's crimes, suffered a complete mental collapse. She was committed to an asylum in Richmond, where she spent her remaining years insisting that the whole affair had been a misunderstanding, that her husband had been a good and godly man who could never have harmed a child. As for me, I was granted my freedom by a special act of the Virginia legislature, an unprecedented recognition of my service in exposing such heinous crimes. The federal government provided me with safe passage to Philadelphia, where I was welcomed by the abolitionist community as a hero and a symbol of the intelligence and courage that slavery had tried to suppress. But freedom, I discovered, music, came with its own challenges. After 5 years of living with terrible secrets, I found it difficult to adjust to a world where I could speak openly about my experiences. The nightmares that had plagued me during my years of silent observation continued, filled with images of small graves and the faces of children I had been unable to save. Yet, I also found purpose in my freedom. The evidence I had gathered and the story I could tell became powerful weapons in the fight against slavery. I spoke at abolitionist meetings across the North, sharing my testimony about the horrors that could be hidden behind the facade of Southern respectability. my story became part of the growing body of evidence that slavery was not just an economic system, but a moral abomination that music corrupted everyone it touched. The image of a respected plantation owner systematically murdering slave children challenged every argument about the benevolent nature of the institution and the supposed care that masters provided for their human property. The 12 graves in the Virginia forest became a symbol of slavery's ultimate evil. The reduction of human beings to such a state of powerlessness that their children could be murdered with impunity. And my 5 years of silent documentation became proof that even in the darkest circumstances, the human spirit could find ways to bear witness to injustice and ultimately bring truth to light. Music. The train that carried me away from Virginia in the summer of 1854 was the first I had ever ridden, and the sensation of movement, of actually traveling toward freedom rather than simply dreaming of it, was almost overwhelming. I pressed my face against the window, watching the landscape of my bondage disappear behind me, but I could not escape the weight of what I had witnessed and documented over the past 5 years. William Harrison sat across from me in the colored car, his face grave as he reviewed music, the final reports he would submit to his superiors in Washington. The evidence I had provided had exceeded every expectation, creating a scandal that would reverberate through the highest levels of government and society. "Octavia," he said, looking up from his papers, "you understand that your story will not end with your freedom. What you've exposed will be used to challenge the entire institution of slavery. Are you prepared for that responsibility?" I considered his question carefully. For 5 years, I had lived with secrets that could destroy lives and change history. Now those secrets were becoming public knowledge, and I would be forever associated with the horrors they revealed. "Mr. Harrison," I replied, "I've been carrying the weight of 12 dead children for 5 years. If their deaths can help end the system that killed them, then I'm prepared to carry that weight for the rest of my life." The journey to Philadelphia took 3 days, during which Harrison briefed me on what to expect in my new life. The abolitionist community was eager, music, to hear my testimony, but they were also protective of former slaves who had risked everything to expose the truth about their experiences. I would be provided with housing, education, and employment. Music. But I would also be expected to share my story with audiences who needed to understand the reality of slavery. "The details of what you witnessed are horrific," Harrison warned me, "but they're also necessary." Music. Too many people in the North have romanticized notions about slavery. They imagine kindly masters and grateful slaves living in harmony. Your testimony will shatter those illusions and force people to confront the truth. When we arrived in Philadelphia, I was met by a delegation from the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society, led by a remarkable woman named Lucretia Mott. She was small in stature, but possessed a presence that commanded immediate respect. And her first words to me demonstrated the compassion that would characterize my reception in the abolitionist community. "Welcome to freedom, Octavia," she said, taking my hands in hers. "We've heard about your courage, and we're honored to help you begin your new life." The house where I was taken was unlike anything I had ever seen. A comfortable middle-class home where black and white activists worked together as equals, planning strategies, music, and sharing resources in their fight against slavery. For the first time in my life, I was in a place where my intelligence was valued rather than feared, where my literacy was seen as a gift rather than a crime. But adjusting to freedom was more difficult than I had anticipated. After 22 years of slavery, music, I found it almost impossible to make decisions about my own life. Simple choices, music, what to eat, when to sleep, how to spend my time, felt overwhelming after years of having every moment controlled by others. The nightmares were worse. In slavery, I had been too exhausted and too focused on survival to fully process the trauma of what I had witnessed. In freedom, with time to think and reflect, the full horror of Master Randolph's crimes crashed over me like a wave. I would wake, music screaming, reliving the moment when I had been forced to bury Joshua alive, seeing Mary's small hand reaching up from her grave. Lucretia Mott recognized the signs of what we, music, would now call post-traumatic stress, though such terms didn't exist in 1854. She arranged for me to speak with other former slaves who had experienced similar trauma, and slowly I began to understand that my psychological wounds were as real and as serious as any physical injury. "Healing takes time," she told me during music, one of our conversations. "You've survived something that would have broken most people. Give yourself permission to grieve, to feel angry, to struggle with the memories, but don't let them define you. You have a voice now and the world needs to hear it. My first public speaking engagement was at a small Quaker meeting house outside Philadelphia. The audience was sympathetic abolitionists who already believed in the evils of slavery. But I was terrified nonetheless. For 5 years I had lived in silence. And now I was being asked to speak publicly about the most traumatic experiences of my life. I began hesitantly, music describing my childhood on the Randolph Plantation and my mother's secret gift of literacy. But as I continued, the words began to flow more easily. I told them about the missing children, about following Master Randolph into the forest, about the 12 graves hidden among the trees. The audience listened in stunned silence as I described the systematic murder of slave children, the casual way Master Randolph had disposed of young lives, and my 5 years of secret documentation. When I finished, there was a long moment of complete quiet before the questions began. "How could such horrors exist without anyone knowing?" asked one woman, her voice shaking with emotion. "Because slaves are invisible to white society," I replied. Music. We are present but not seen, listening but not heard. Master Randolph committed his crimes in plain sight because he knew that no one would believe the testimony of a slave, even if we had been allowed to speak. The impact of my testimony was immediate and profound. Word of my story spread quickly through the abolitionist network, and I began receiving invitations to speak at churches, schools, and political meetings across the North. Each appearance drew larger crowds, and my account of the 12 graves became one of the most powerful pieces of evidence in the growing case against slavery. But the response in the South was predictably music hostile. Southern newspapers denounced my testimony as Northern propaganda, claiming that I was either lying or had been coached by abolitionists to fabricate my story. Some went so far as to suggest that the graves had been planted as evidence that the entire affair was a conspiracy to discredit Southern society. The most painful attacks came from those who had known me during my years of slavery. Former overseers and house slaves who had remained loyal to their masters publicly questioned my character and my motives. They portrayed me as an ungrateful servant who had betrayed the family that had cared for her, conveniently ignoring the fact that care had included forcing me to participate in the murder of a child. These attacks hurt more than I had expected. I had hoped that other slaves would understand why I, music, had chosen to speak out. But many were too frightened or too indoctrinated to support my decision. The slave system had, music, taught them that survival depended on loyalty to their masters, and my testimony threatened that fundamental belief. Despite the criticism, I continued speaking, driven by the memory of 12 dead children and the knowledge that my voice might prevent other such tragedies. I spoke at the Female Anti-Slavery Society in Boston, where I met Sojourner Truth, another former slave who had music become a powerful advocate for freedom. Her strength and wisdom helped me understand that my trauma could become a source of power rather than weakness. "Child," she told me after hearing my testimony, "you've been through hell and come out the other side with your soul intact. That's not something to be ashamed of. That's something to be proud of. Use that strength to help others find their way to freedom." I also met Harriet Tubman, the legendary conductor of the Underground Railroad, music, who understood better than anyone the courage required to challenge the slave system. She listened to my story with the intense focus of someone who had faced music's similar dangers, and her response was characteristically direct. "You did what needed doing," she said simply. "Those children's deaths weren't in vain if music, help end this evil system. Keep talking. Keep telling the truth. That's how we win." As the 1850s music progressed and the nation moved inexorably towards civil war, my testimony became part of the broader abolitionist campaign to expose the moral bankruptcy, music, of slavery. The story of the 12 graves appeared in newspapers, pamphlets, and books, reaching audiences far beyond the traditional abolitionist community. I began work on my autobiography in 1857, 3 years after gaining my freedom, music. 5 Years of Silence, A Slave's Testament was published in 1859 and became an immediate bestseller in the North. The book provided a detailed account of my experiences, music including excerpts from the evidence I had gathered and maps showing the locations of Master Randolph's victims. The publication of my book coincided with increasing tensions between North and South over the expansion of slavery, music, into new territories. My story became part of the evidence cited by politicians like Abraham Lincoln, who argued that slavery was incompatible with American values of human dignity and moral progress. The case of Octavia and the 12 graves, Lincoln said in one of his speeches, demonstrates that slavery doesn't just deny freedom to its victims, it corrupts the souls of its perpetrators. No society that allows such horrors can claim to be civilized or Christian. When the Civil War finally began in 1861, I volunteered to work with the Union Army, helping to care for escaped slaves and serving as a translator between military officials and refugees who spoke music, only African languages or slave dialects. My literacy and my understanding of plantation life made me valuable in intelligence gathering, as I could interpret documents captured from Confederate forces and interview escaped slaves about conditions in the South. The war years were difficult, but also hopeful. For the first time since childhood, I could see the possibility that slavery might actually end, that the system that had created monsters like Master Randolph might be destroyed forever. When the Emancipation Proclamation was announced in 1863, I wept with joy, thinking of all the children who would never have to face the horrors I had witnessed. After the war ended, I returned to Virginia for the first time since my escape. The Randolph Plantation had been abandoned during the conflict, its fields overgrown and its buildings falling into ruin. I made a pilgrimage to the forest where I had discovered the graves, finding that the sites had been marked with simple wooden crosses by local residents who wanted to honor the murdered children. Standing in that forest, surrounded by the graves I had found through 5 years of patient investigation, I felt a sense of completion that I had never expected to experience. The children were finally at peace, their deaths acknowledged and their memory preserved. The monster who had killed them was dead, and the system that had enabled his crimes was crumbling. I spent my later years working with the Freedmen's Bureau, helping former slaves learn to read and write and adjust to their new lives in freedom. I established schools in Virginia and North Carolina, using my own experience to help others understand the power of education and the importance of bearing witness to injustice. I died in 1889, at the age of 57, surrounded by former students who had become teachers themselves, carrying on the work of education and empowerment. My funeral was attended by hundreds of people, former slaves, white allies, politicians, and activists who had been inspired by my story. But perhaps the most meaningful tribute came from an unexpected source. A group of children from the school I had established in Virginia came to my funeral carrying 12 white roses, one for each of the children whose deaths I had documented and whose memory I had preserved. "Miss Octavia," one of them said as they placed the roses on my coffin, "you taught us that our voices matter, that we have the power to speak truth and change the world. We promise to keep telling your story and the story of the 12 children who couldn't speak for themselves. My legacy lived on in the testimonies of those I had taught, in the schools I had established, and in the historical record I had created through 5 years of dangerous documentation. The evidence I had gathered, became part of the permanent record of slavery's horrors, preserved in archives and libraries where future generations could study the true nature of the institution that had once seemed so permanent and unshakable. The story of the 12 graves became a touchstone for understanding how slavery corrupted not just the enslaved, but their enslavers as well. Master Randolph had not been born a monster. He had been created by a system that taught him to view human beings as property, that gave him absolute power over other people's lives, and that provided no accountability for his actions. Historians who studied my case noted that Randolph's crimes were not aberrations but logical extensions of slavery's fundamental premise. If human beings could be owned, bought, and sold like livestock, then it was only a small step to treating them as disposable when they became inconvenient or unprofitable. The 12 children buried in that Virginia forest were victims not just of one man's depravity, but of an entire society's moral blindness. My autobiography continued to be read and studied long after my death, serving as a primary source document for scholars researching the lived experience of slavery. The detailed evidence I had gathered, the maps, the copied letters, the witness accounts, provided historians with an unprecedented window into the daily operations of a slave plantation and the psychology of those who ran it. But perhaps more importantly, my story demonstrated the power of literacy and documentation in the fight for justice. The reading and writing skills my mother had given me in secret had ultimately become the weapons that brought down a murderer and helped expose the moral bankruptcy of slavery itself. The evidence I had patiently gathered over 5 years proved that even the most powerless people could find ways to bear witness to injustice and preserve the truth for future generations. The 12 children whose deaths I had documented were finally given proper burials in a cemetery established specifically to honor the victims of slavery's violence. Their graves were marked with headstones bearing their names and ages, ensuring that they would be remembered as individuals rather than forgotten statistics. The cemetery became a place of pilgrimage for those seeking to understand the human cost of America's original sin. In 1954, exactly 100 years after I had exposed Master Randolph's crimes, the Supreme Court issued its decision in Brown v. Board of Education, declaring that separate educational facilities were inherently unequal. The lawyers who argued that case music cited historical evidence of slavery's impact on American society, including testimony from cases like mine that demonstrated the systematic dehumanization of African Americans. My story had become part of the long arc of American history, a reminder that the struggle for justice and human dignity was ongoing, that each generation had to choose between silence and speech, between complicity and courage. The voice I had found in that Philadelphia meeting house in 1854 had joined a chorus of other voices demanding recognition of our common humanity. The schools I had established continued to operate well into the 20th century. Music, educating thousands of children who might otherwise have been denied the gift of literacy. Many of my former students became teachers themselves, spreading the lesson that education was both a right and a responsibility, that knowledge was power that should be shared rather than hoarded. As America grappled with the legacy of slavery in the decades following my death, my story served as a reminder that the institution's effects had been far more pervasive and destructive than many wanted to acknowledge. The 12 graves in the Virginia forest stood as evidence that slavery had not been the benevolent system that some nostalgic narratives claimed, but a regime of terror that had allowed the systematic murder of children to go undetected for more than a decade. The courage I had shown in documenting and exposing these crimes became a model for other whistleblowers and witnesses who faced similar choices between safety and truth. Civil rights activists in the 1960s referenced my story as an example of how individual acts of courage could challenge seemingly insurmountable systems of oppression. My autobiography was republished several times throughout the 20th century, each new edition reaching fresh audiences who needed to understand the realities of slavery and its aftermath. The book was translated into multiple languages and became required reading in many schools and universities, ensuring that the lessons of my experience would not be forgotten. The forest where Master Randolph had buried his victims was eventually preserved as a historical site with interpretive music trails and educational materials that helped visitors understand what had happened there. The site became a powerful reminder of the importance of bearing witness to injustice and the responsibility that each generation bears to protect the vulnerable from those who would exploit or harm them. But perhaps the most lasting impact of my story was the way it demonstrated that literacy and documentation could serve as forms of resistance, even under the most oppressive circumstances. The reading and writing skills that had been forbidden to slaves proved to be the very tools that could expose slavery's crimes and preserve the truth for future generations. The 5 years I had spent in silence, gathering evidence and documenting horrors, had ultimately given voice to 12 children who could no longer speak for themselves. Their deaths had not been in vain if they helped others understand the true music nature of slavery and the importance of protecting human dignity in all circumstances. As I had written in the final chapter of my autobiography, I pray that future generations will never again allow such horrors to occur in music's silence. May they have the courage to speak when they witness injustice, the wisdom to document what they see, and the determination to ensure that the truth is preserved and shared. The children who died in that Virginia forest deserve nothing less than our eternal vigilance against the forces that would reduce human beings to property. If this powerful story of courage, documentation, and ultimate justice has moved you, we invite you to share your thoughts about Octavia's remarkable journey. Comment below and tell us where in the world you're watching from and what lessons you take from this incredible tale, music of one woman's fight against unimaginable evil. Subscribe to our channel to discover more hidden stories of resistance and courage from America's complex past. Stories that remind us that even in the darkest times, the human spirit can find ways to preserve truth and seek justice. This was the story of Octavia, the slave who became a spy in her master's house and used the gift of literacy to expose one of the most horrific crimes in American history. Her 5 years of silent documentation proved that even the most powerless individuals could find ways to bear witness to injustice and ultimately bring truth to light. Her legacy reminds us that the fight for justice often requires extraordinary courage from ordinary people and that the tools of resistance, literacy, documentation, music, and the willingness to speak truth to power remain as relevant today as they were in 1854. The 12 children who died in that Virginia forest found their voice through Octavia's testimony, and their memory continues to inspire all who believe in the fundamental dignity and worth of every human life.